Supermarkets are pushing back hard against growing pressure to cap the prices of everyday essentials like milk, bread, and eggs. Governments, consumer groups, and frustrated shoppers say food prices have climbed too high, too fast, and they want retailers to step in. But major supermarket chains argue that putting price caps on staple goods could create even bigger problems for consumers and the economy. Over the past few years, grocery prices have become one of the biggest financial pressures on households around the world. Families are paying noticeably more for basic food items that used to be considered affordable necessities. Milk, bread, and eggs have become symbolic products in the cost of living crisis because almost every household buys them regularly. When prices rise on these staples, consumers feel it immediately. As inflation continues to squeeze household budgets, politicians and advocacy groups have started calling for supermarkets to limit price increases or temporarily cap prices on essential goods. Supporters of the idea say supermarkets are making large profits while ordinary people struggle to put food on the table. They argue that essential items should remain affordable no matter what is happening in the wider economy. But supermarkets say the situation is far more complicated than many people realize. Retailers argue that grocery stores are only one part of a much larger supply chain. According to supermarket executives, the cost of producing and transporting food has increased dramatically. Farmers are paying more for animal feed, fertilizer, fuel, electricity, labor, and packaging. Food manufacturers are also facing higher operating costs. On top of that, shipping and logistics expenses remain elevated in many regions. Supermarkets claim that when suppliers charge more, retailers are forced to pass at least some of those costs on to customers. They say price caps may sound attractive politically, but they could eventually lead to shortages, reduce product quality, or even higher prices elsewhere in the store. One of the biggest arguments from retailers is that supermarkets actually operate on very thin profit margins. While grocery chains generate billions in sales, the percentage they keep as profit is often surprisingly small. Industry representatives say many consumers mistakenly assume supermarkets are making huge profits on products like milk or bread, when in reality those items are often sold with very little markup. Milk is a perfect example. Dairy producers have faced rising feed costs, energy bills, and transportation expenses. If supermarkets are forced to sell milk below a certain price, retailers say somebody in the supply chain will absorb the losses. That could mean farmers earning less money, which may eventually reduce production and create supply problems. Bread prices have also surged due to rising wheat costs, fuel prices, labor shortages, and energy-intensive baking operations. Bakers and food producers argue that their production costs have increased substantially over the past few years. Supermarkets insist they cannot simply freeze bread prices without damaging relationships with suppliers or cutting into already narrow margins. Egg prices became especially controversial after major spikes linked to disease outbreaks affecting poultry farms in several countries. Supply shortages caused dramatic price increases, leading consumers to accuse retailers of price gouging. However, supermarkets say the shortages were real and unavoidable, driven by reduced production and higher farming costs rather than excessive profiteering. Consumer groups are not fully convinced by these arguments. Critics point to financial reports showing that some supermarket chains continue to post strong revenues and shareholder returns even during periods of rising food prices. Advocacy organizations argue that large retailers have enormous bargaining power over suppliers and should do more to protect customers during economic hardship. Some economists believe supermarkets may not be solely responsible for rising prices, but they also argue that the grocery industry lacks transparency. They say consumers often do not know how much of a price increase comes from farmers, manufacturers, distributors, or retailers themselves. That lack of visibility fuels public suspicion. Governments in several countries are now exploring different approaches to tackle food inflation. Some have discussed voluntary pricing agreements with supermarkets. Others are considering temporary price controls on essential goods. In certain markets, political leaders have publicly pressured grocery chains to reduce prices or justify their profit margins. Supermarkets warn that direct government intervention could have unintended consequences. Retail groups say price caps can distort markets and discourage suppliers from producing enough goods. If producers cannot recover their costs, they may cut production, leading to shortages on store shelves. Economists often point to historical examples where strict price controls created scarcity rather than affordability. Retailers also argue that competition between supermarkets already helps keep prices lower. In highly competitive grocery markets, chains constantly battle for customers through discounts, loyalty programs, and promotional offers. Supermarkets claim that if one retailer raises prices too aggressively, shoppers can switch to competitors. However, critics respond that competition alone has not been enough to stop food prices from climbing rapidly. They argue that many households no longer have the flexibility to shop around because prices are increasing almost everywhere at the same time. The debate has become increasingly emotional because food is not a luxury product. People can delay buying electronics or cancel vacations during difficult economic periods, but they still need to eat every day. Rising grocery bills affect low-income households the hardest, forcing many families to make painful decisions about nutrition and spending. Some analysts believe the solution may lie somewhere in the middle. Instead of strict price caps, governments could focus on increasing transparency in the food supply chain, supporting farmers with subsidies, reducing energy costs, or temporarily lowering taxes on essential goods. Others suggest targeted assistance for struggling households rather than broad market controls.